As you may already know, the entire Oathsworn campaign consists of about 20 chapters, and each chapter has two very distinct parts. First comes the story part, which relies heavily on the story journal, a location map, and a timer track. Then there's the encounter part, which is the big boss battle, using the miniatures, the hex-based game board, and so on. There's a whole rulebook dedicated to the story part, but I won't go into it here, because honestly, I think that once you've read the story rulebook, it's pretty straightforward. It's the encounter rules where things sometimes get kind of tricky, so that's what I'm going to focus on in these videos. There's another reason I'm glossing over the story phase, which is that Paul Grogan, over on the Gaming Rules channel, has already made a video about the story rules, and as usual, he nailed it. I'll link to that in the description, and I highly recommend it. Even though he was working from a prototype, all the rules he explains in that particular video are still accurate in the final version of the game. Now, quite a lot can happen during the story part of a chapter, such as gaining items and combat tokens, or losing a hit point or two. But since I'm skipping the entire story in this video, I'll just fake it by giving each character a few combat tokens at random and knocking off a couple of hit points. There we go, I just shortened this video by at least half an hour. Incidentally, the game offers a similar mechanism called Instant Action Mode. It replaces the story phase with a short synopsis of the narrative, a few checks, and the chance to acquire some rewards. Personally, I think that skipping the Oathsworn story makes about as much sense as opening a box of chocolates and immediately throwing half of them away, but to each their own. After the story part of the chapter, we'll move on to the encounter part. When it comes to setup, the rulebooks have you well covered. There are even instructions for saving and restoring the game between play sessions. I won't go over all the encounter setup here, but there are some new game components which get introduced at this point, so let's take a quick look. That way, when the battle begins, I won't get too bogged down explaining the basics. Your gruesome injuries this evening will be provided by the horrifying broodmother, who looks like this. There are a couple of boards describing your enemies, and you don't want to get them mixed up. The special rules board contains the stats and abilities for the enemies, and this is considered secret, so you need to keep that face down. You won't know exactly what you're up against until the battle begins. The one exception to this is the special rules checkbox on the free company sheet. If you manage to check that off during the story phase, then you get to look at the special rules board right away, even before players decide what to take into battle. The other board is the encounter board, which you set up by placing the hit point dice on the various enemy locations. This isn't secret, so you can look at it before you set up the free company. Enemies also have a 15 card stage deck divided into 3 stages. I'll separate these into 3 piles with matching numbers, then shuffle each pile separately. And finally, combine them into a single deck with stage 3 cards at the bottom, stage 2 in the middle, and stage 1 on top. Of course, you'll also need to set up the game board. There's a dedicated encounter book which shows you where to place the miniatures and terrain. For this video, I'm only using a rough approximation of the Chapter 1 setup. The broodmother looks like this from above. The base of the miniature is actually round, but it's considered to fill these 7 hexes, which I'll highlight in red for clarity. There's also a little arrow at the front of the base to help identify the exact direction it's facing. And the broodmother's minions are single hex enemies called giant rats, which look like this. Now, each of my full Oathsworn characters gets to select 7 ability cards to take into battle. The icon at the top indicates which character it belongs to, and below that is the card's name and level. The star on this card indicates that it's a starting card, in other words, level 1. By the way, Oathsworn levels are really easy, as they're always equal to the current chapter number. In the top left corner is the animus cost of playing the card for one of its abilities. Often you'll see a list of multiple abilities separated by horizontal lines, but you only get to choose one of the abilities when you play the card. At the very bottom of the card is the defense value on a blue shield. If you're about to be attacked, you can play an ability card to temporarily boost your defense value by the amount shown here. As we'll see shortly, doing so doesn't cost any animus, and it's completely separate from the abilities on the card. Finally, in the top right corner is the cooldown value of the card. This seems like as good a time as any to learn about cooldown and Battleflow, so let's do it. After you've finished playing an ability card, you'll place it into one of the 4 cooldown positions around the outside of the character board, based on the card's cooldown value. This will place it out of reach for a while, since you can only play cards which are in your hand. But before placing it there, all other cards in that cooldown position get moved to the next position down. And if they're already in the lowest position, they move back into your hand. This is called Battleflow, and thematically it represents your momentum in combat. Pretty simple really, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. Firstly, Battleflow never cascades or causes a chain reaction. For example, if I play this ability card with a cooldown of 3, then only the cards which were already in position 3 will move. Cards in other cooldown positions won't move at all. The second thing to remember is that item cards and injury cards also get placed in cooldown positions, but they don't trigger Battleflow. You just place them on top of any cards already at that position. This is in contrast to ability cards, which do trigger Battleflow when played. If you forget this rule more than once per game, a representative from Shadowborn Games will come round to your house and brand a reminder onto the inside of your wrist. So it pays to be careful. Fortunately, all these cards have a tiny icon next to the cooldown number to remind you whether or not it will trigger Battleflow. Of course, we'll see all this in action very shortly. And this is the icon for Battleflow, by the way. The centre represents a stack of cards in one cooldown location, and the arrow represents the way cards move anti-clockwise around the player board. Characters start every encounter with a hand of 7 ability cards. At the start of the campaign, those will be the 7 starter cards marked with a star. But in future chapters, you'll unlock additional ability cards, so you'll need to choose which ones to take into battle. You always take exactly 2 cards for each cooldown position, except position 0, which gets 1 card. As mentioned, companions don't use ability cards or cooldown positions, but they do get 1 archetype card instead. You can think of this as a stand-in for the 7 ability cards which full characters get. Archetype cards are character specific, and they contain 2 abilities which are relevant to that character. In fact, there's another combination of 2 abilities on the back of the card, but I'll need to choose one side and stick with it throughout the encounter. Of course, we're starting the campaign with level 1 archetype cards, but future chapters will unlock a selection of cards from which you'll choose one. And for the Ursus Warbear, I've chosen this side of the card. We'll learn more about companions as we go, but I'll quickly point out that there are really just 2 fundamental differences between companions and full characters. And I've already introduced both of those differences. Firstly, that companions don't use ability cards or cooldown positions, and secondly, when it comes to spending animus, they have their own exchange rates. Everything else we'll learn about companions will be natural consequences of these 2 differences. Okay, enough talk. It's finally time to draw our weapons and venture out onto the battlefield. We won't play an entire encounter, but we will play a series of rounds in which I focus on just a few rules each round. I'll just flip the special rules board, reveal the first stage card, and we're ready to go.